afternoon, good evening for all of you who are joining. Thanks so much for coming to this webinar hosted by the M20, and thank you all for taking the time. I think we're going to have a wonderful discussion. My name is Irene J. Liu, and I'm the Director for AI and Emerging Tech at the International Fund for Public Interest Media. And I will be your moderator and facilitator for the next hour. I think we want to keep this a pretty free-flowing and kind of just conversational conversation. And so if I can ask anyone who is on the webinar, if you feel so inclined, please do use the chat and introduce yourself to the group. I think my lovely and wonderful co-panelists will introduce themselves, but we'd like to know who you are. And please, again, use the chat to have a discussion. Add your thoughts and your questions throughout the next hour, and we'll have a great conversation. With that, I'd love to allow my co-panelists to introduce themselves, and I'll start at the top for my screen, which is Wendy. Please go ahead.
Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. My name is Wendy Trott. I am an Associate Director at Alt Advisory. We are a human rights consulting firm, a collective of human rights lawyers, technologists, researchers who provide various forms of support to public interest organizations around the world, with a particular focus on the intersection between human rights and technology. So that's how we come at this particular issue. It's lovely to be here today with all of you.
Great. Ana Cristina?
Hi, everyone. I'm Ana Cristina Ruelas, and I'm part of the Freedom of Expression Safety of Journalists section at UNESCO Communication and Information sector. And I lead the work on freedom of expression in the digital environment, particularly work related to the implementation and the relationship with the guidelines for with digital platforms.
Great. And Janine?
Hello, everyone. I'm Janine Deselas. I'm a postdoc fellow at the CINIA Institute. Well, it's a Center for Information Integrity in Africa, based at the University of Stellenbosch, aimed to promoting accurate and reliable information across the continent, and also hoping to foster some sort of collaboration between Global South initiatives more broadly in the field of information integrity. I personally come more from a background of researching digital activism with a feminist perspective, but really hoping to grow into information integrity more broadly across the African continent with my fellowship.
Fantastic. Thank you all. And we will be joined at the end by one more contributor, Michael Markovitz from the GIBS Media Leadership Think Tank. And he's also part of the M20 and was part of the team that helped to draft the guidelines. And so we'll be able to have him come in as well. So you may see another face pop on screen. Don't be surprised or scared. He is supposed to be here. So with that, why don't we just kick right in? So I think that, we all know why we're here. We're here to discuss the UNESCO Fair Compensation Guidelines for news. There's an actual action to be taken after this as well, because it is still open for comment and for discussion until July 30th. So we have 9 days if you want to submit, response to the guidelines. And I think from the IFHIM perspective, we are thrilled to be able to help to contribute to the conversation, because the sustainability of news is integral to the work that the International Fund does. We are a multilateral organization that is making an effort to help support the long-term sustainability of news and information, with particular focus on low and middle income countries in the Global South and Eastern Europe. And the reason why we have this focus is we believe that news and information is critical for the functioning of society. Oh, and Michael is here very early. Since you just caught me right as I was about to give remarks, I'm gonna finish mine, then I'll let you introduce yourself, Michael, if that's all right. But basically, we feel that we are really, truly at an inflection point in the kind of evolution of technology and how people are using information. We've had many waves of disruption, from the printing press through to radio, television, through to the internet, social media, and now, of course, AI. Blockchain seems to not have really been terribly disruptive at the moment, but you never know where things will go. But I think what is interesting and requires a lot of focus for us is that all of these technologies have been cumulative over time. And because of that, you can't say, okay, let's just focus on the new thing. We have to look at the accumulation of all these technologies and how they are affecting the information ecosystem. And part of that, of course, is the many different kind of tools that have been used to try to tackle this issue, whether it's technological, whether it's regulation, whether it is a focus on sustainability in business, and also on the rights of people and kind of very, very fundamental access issues that we see that are a result of economic disparity. So it's a multifaceted issue that requires, on the one hand, focus, because it's very easy to get overwhelmed by all the different factors, but at the same time, needing to take a holistic approach and also a local one. One thing that we've seen, of course, is that the conversation has been really one that started when it comes to the question of regulation at a local and a national level. And over the past few years, we begin to see more and more conversation that is crossing borders. And I think that this latest guideline is really a reflection of that trend and the desire for cross-border information exchange and thinking through that. But I will leave my soapbox now and hand it over to Ana Cristina, who can talk a little. Oh, sorry, I forgot. Michael, I'm going to let you introduce yourself first, and then we're going to hand over to Ana Cristina.
I'm wearing many different hats, as a lot of people do. I'm the director of the Media Leadership Think Tank, which is played a role together with Alt Advisory and is facilitated by the M20 in assisting with the guidance doc, and it's a great opportunity to be part of it. Just a bit of background: I've been asked to speak on behalf of the M20. I don't know if anyone has done that yet, so let me just do that. As most of you will know, the M20 is a sort of an unofficial engagement group that was set up to engage with the G20 process. There was a Johannesburg Declaration last year where there were specific references to the need to follow up on UNESCO's guidance document, the guidelines document, which was so important in the whole genesis of this area of regulating digital platforms. And then in Pretoria, there was quite an engagement from the M20 to see how we could facilitate another process as a companion to the existing guidelines in order to address these key issues, which Irene has already mentioned. So we're really great to be part. It's really great to be part of this today and this process. And I'll just leave it at that now. Irene, I can jump in a bit later. And if anyone's got specific questions about the M20, happy to answer that and anything else. Thank you.
Thanks, Michael. And don't forget, please do use the chat that you have to introduce yourself or ask any questions or even add any comments that you have throughout the presentation. We want this to be an engaging conversation with everyone who is participating. And with that, I'd love to turn now to Ana Cristina to talk about why UNESCO decided to initiate this project.
So thank you very much, Irene and colleagues. It's a pleasure to join this conversation. So I want to take back what you, Irene, and Michael just mentioned. We are not doing this out of the vacuum. It comes from a lot of work that UNESCO has been, and where UNESCO has been engaging with different stakeholders, with different actors, in order to advance information integrity and information as a public good, acknowledging that to achieve information as a public good, we need the media development and media viability, but we also need an enabling environment that allows journalists to thrive that requires platforms to comply with 5 key principles: human rights due diligence, transparency, accountability, alignment to international human rights standards in all operations and systems, and user empowerment. And this comes right with the guidelines for the governance of digital platforms, which is this, let's say, mother document that was issued and launched in October 2023 after a broad consultation process where all of you participated. And it also comes together with another key action that UNESCO has been developing through the International Program for the Development of Communication, that is the Media Viability Manifesto, that says that it is very important to create a strategic coordination among the different stakeholders in order to make sure that media is not only viable, but also is sustainable. And this is let's say, the genealogy of why we're here. And right now, as you mentioned, we are in the moment where we are consulting on the document. This means that is not anything that you read there is not set in the stone. As we did in the guidelines for the governance of digital platforms, we received inputs, 10,000 inputs from different countries from around the world, and that allowed to shape a document that started from one side and ended in another side, because we truly believe that the participation of everyone will allow us to make it better. So this is one thing. The other thing is that for UNESCO, it's very important to acknowledge that we will not achieve a change in information integrity, that we will not achieve safeguarding freedom of expression and access to information if media is not part of the governance system, if media is not considered as part of the governance system. And for this reason is that the guidelines outline the necessity of creating investment mechanisms to support the media and the information environment, but also the guidelines mention that it is very, very important to create mechanisms to integrate the media, not only as watchdogs of what the platforms and AI companies are doing, but as a key actors in the governance mechanisms, in the governance processes, in creating and making sure that whatever they're putting in place to support, to advance these 5 key principles that I spoke about, are completed. And as well, to ensure that governments fulfill their duty to enable this environment of freedom of expression, that governments are responsible also for the transparency of the actions they engage with digital platforms and AI actors. We need all of these elements together in order to make sure that we have this trustworthy information ecosystem that we are aiming for.
Thank you so much, Ana Cristina. Wendy, could I actually turn to you now as one of the co-authors of the guidelines, who has been able to have sort of an overarching view of the 10,000 comments and other interventions that kind of were synthesized for the project. Would you mind telling us what are the highlights that you have come away with, and to you, what are the outstanding questions that remain as we move into the consultation phase of these guidelines?
Thank you, Irene. I'm not sure exactly how many comments we've gotten so far, but I really hope we will get at least 10,000 or more. But yeah, so a little bit of background, as I said before, Alt Advisory has been supporting this drafting process with UNESCO together with the M20 Secretariat and the Media Leadership Think Tank. And what that means is that I think first and foremost, our most important responsibility has been to make this a highly consultative and participatory process. And so we have tried to structure a consultation and a drafting process in which we can ensure that perspectives from all over the world can be incorporated into this draft, because this is a global problem and it manifests in very different ways in different circumstances in different jurisdictions. And so it's not just a nice to have that we make this a participatory process. It's absolutely critical to getting to an output that is meaningful and effective and achieves what we want it to achieve. And so I'll very briefly speak to what that process has been so far. We started with targeted consultations with some key experts from around the world that represented different countries and regions, as well as different sectors of society, different parts of the ecosystem. So, media representatives, academics, civil society, government, regulators, all those sorts of stakeholders, to make sure that we were getting a diversity of perspectives. And that informed the very first draft, which has now been published for comment. Now is this kind of open consultation process. UNESCO is facilitating 3 roundtables, one of which is tomorrow. So if you have not yet registered, please do register for that. The second one will be held tomorrow, and then the third one will be held next week. So that's another opportunity for people to provide their inputs. There is also an open survey. I believe the link has been shared to it, or if not, we will make sure that it is circulated. And there's an open email inbox, the Internet Conference at UNESCO.org email inbox, through which we welcome submissions. And so just to reiterate what Anna Christina has already said, this is very much a work in progress. This is still a draft, the one that has been published now, and we would welcome all perspectives so that we can ensure that this becomes a really solid normative framework to guide these compensation discussions going forward. And then just to speak about briefly to your question about kind of how this has been approached and the framing for the guidance document as it currently stands, there were several things that we knew we needed to achieve, at least with the first draft, to stimulate conversation in a meaningful way. The first is to, at a very high level, set out the problem. What is the problem in the media ecosystem at the moment? This kind of fundamental disruption of the sustainability model for media, the way that advertising has collapsed, the way that the relationship between news producers and their audiences has been fundamentally changed as a result of these various new technologies, and that is continuing in a very dynamic fashion. We have seen with the rise of generative AI in the most recent kind of few years that this is a very rapidly developing issue. And so it's something that we wanted to set out what the problem is as it currently stands, and also as we see it going forward. And then to set out the various mechanisms that have been tried and tested in various different places around the world so far. There's a lot of different kind of components of approaches that we've seen tested in different places, and there's been a lot of debate about what works and what doesn't work. And so a key purpose of this guidance document is to provide some clarity for people who are looking to develop policy approaches on what has been done and what works and why in different circumstances, acknowledging that every jurisdiction will be different, every circumstance will be different, and the aim is not for this guidance document to be a prescriptive document, but rather to provide clarity and guidance based on some underlying fundamental principles. The most important of which, I think, is acknowledging that this is a democratic issue and it's a human rights issue. It's not a commercial issue. It's not something where the media are just looking to get some free cash out of something. It's a reflection of a fundamental market inequality and a structural problem in the market. And there are severe democratic consequences for this issue that we're facing. Not only because I think everyone in this audience probably fully understands the value of an independent media to democracy, but also just because everyone benefits from a robust, plural information ecosystem, including the technology platforms themselves. These generative AI platforms will only continue to disintegrate if we continue to feed information into them that is not high quality and reliable. So we wanted to start from that premise, acknowledging that this is a democratic and a democratic issue, and it's a fundamental problem. It's not a transactional thing, and it's not a short-term solution. So that's the overarching goal of the guidance. And then everything kind of flows from there, setting out the principles that we think should underlie any policy approaches, setting out the various responsibilities of the actors, those sorts of things.
Thank you, Wendy. And just to note that if you haven't had the opportunity to read the guidance, you can access it. The links have been posted in the chat, and also there is a survey where you can offer you can offer your insights during this consultation phase. So please do click on those links and save them for after. But really hoping that everyone here will offer and contribute to this process. With that, I'd like to turn now to Janine to talk a little bit about sort of what this means and kind of the reaction to the response to the guidelines from CINIA and also through in the African context. Please, Janine, go ahead.
Sure. Thank you, Irene, for this introduction. And as we have assessed during our pre-webinar introductions, I have not been involved in the drafting of this document, so I come with a bit of an outsider perspective. So when I first read the draft, I thought that it's a great attempt to systematize a field that's been really scattered across different national experiences, or I even want to call them national experiments, perhaps. So this highlights the document highlights the importance of discussing compensation and remuneration frameworks for news. And I really appreciated that it goes back to the logics that lie behind it, as well as then pointing to the early experiences that could already point maybe a bit more to where the focus needs to be shifting to now. So that makes the document really valuable, as well as what Anna Cristina was referring to, also to connect it to a broader framework of documents such as the 2023 guidelines. I think this topic is specifically important for Africa. As you were saying, Irene, we are at an inflection point. I really like that term. And media landscapes are shrinking. At the same time that disinformation networks, some of them are foreign funded, some of them are state-backed, are increasing and filling the space that independent media leave behind when they have to close for lack of funding. And so when we talk about fair compensation for news, that's not just a side conversation for information integrity. I think it's central to it. And whether public interest journalism will survive will determine whether there's a credible, trusted alternative to this disinformation that is already moving in our media ecosystems. I believe that perhaps recent weeks in South Africa have also really shown what happens when disinformation spreads. A question for me when I read this draft was also, the title of the webinar, is this a silver bullet? I took it literally. I didn't just want to take it as a rhetoric question. I wanted to answer it. And sure, I have to say, no, it's not a silver bullet, not just because silver bullets don't exist in policy, but also perhaps because of some of the things that the draft doesn't yet resolve. And my core question would probably be, if we are in the process of building compensation mechanisms for news, how do we ensure that we are actually compensating those media that stand for public interest journalism? Or are we at the risk of potentially rewarding whoever plays best at pretending to make news? I think this is not a hypothetical question, talking about this disinformation networks already. CINIA was also involved in research around this, where right-wing media, for example, mimic legitimate news sources. So eligibility is something that I feel could have been discussed maybe in more depth or analyzed in more depth in the guidance. So that is one of my main points. And then the other point that is so very often reaffirmed in this guidance is that journalism is a public good, media is a public good. But then when we go into the, I'm becoming a bit technical now, but the section B of the guidance that presents these different frameworks or mechanisms that are already in place and starting to be implemented right now, they look very much still on a market logic on how compensation functions. So this is another point where I think perhaps it would have been very nice for the reader to address a bit more in depth on what this then means if we are looking to build new frameworks from here on, also for those countries that don't have them yet, what might fit which context and what are the downfalls we're already observing. So yeah, that's where I would like to maybe see this conversation go today a bit more, not just whether it is a silver bullet, but also maybe on what we would need to get a clearer picture. On those questions that I just mentioned. Compensation doesn't necessarily mean that we are strengthening media diversity. So I want to focus on that.
Thank you, Janine. And I think that is a point that we need to come back to. The question of who benefits from fair compensation, and the question of is the current information producer landscape sufficient to meet the needs of whatever's coming from a technological standpoint as well. So to add to your questions, Janine, for the conversation, that we will pause and park to allow Michael to pile on to the list of questions and open and unresolved areas to be further discussed. I'll hand it to you, Michael.
Thank you, Irene. And, I want to talk about the origins of the word silver bullet. And I knew this, I didn't look it up on AI, but a silver bullet, it comes from ancient European folklore where werewolves, vampires, and witches were believed to be invulnerable to standard weapons and could only be killed by a blessed silver projectile. Now, I knew that anyway, but I'm just saying it's not to be taken literally, obviously. I think the fact that there are so many different mechanisms identified by this guidance is almost answering that question, is that there can't be just one mechanism, there can't just be one solution. And maybe what we are looking at is multifaceted solutions in different jurisdictions. It's not only the one size fits all, but it's not only one thing that can work. We also need to know what the strength of institutions are, etc. But a few points that maybe I can bring out, and I think a reference paragraph 24 in the guidance is that notwithstanding all of these legislative mechanisms and regulatory interventions and competition law interventions, I think it's noteworthy that the platforms still have not accepted the legal basis for any of these fair compensation mechanisms and still characterize payments as charity, okay? And as the guidance put, this kind of weakens the legal rationale of any of these frameworks, because until such time as it's seen as there's a legal basis, I think we've got a long way to go. I also think that the thing that has come up a lot from all the different mechanisms is how do we protect and ensure that smaller independent media is protected in whatever mechanisms that we do. Another area that we need to focus on is that all of these mechanisms really depend on transparency and access to information. And how do we get that metadata access to make any of these mechanisms work? And that's something that we still need to focus a lot on. Obviously, I think the fact is, and that's maybe not the right term to use, but there is no minimum viable model or guidance on which mechanisms are essential versus additive. So, and that's why I think that we've deliberately avoided prescribing one mechanism, because I think that would be foolhardy. It really does depend on your context, the size of your media industry. And I also think that it also depends on the political will of governments in particular jurisdictions to deal with these very, very complex and thorny issues, particularly with jurisdiction, digital sovereignty, etc. So there are many areas that I think the consultation is looking for assistance, Irene, just in terms of how do we get to a point where it can serve as a proper guidance for the governments, for stakeholders, for the media, and all the different people this is aimed at, because ultimately what we've set out is what currently exists and what's being tested. But it's almost a very live situation. It's happening all the time. I mean, just before we were about to conclude the first draft of the report, I think the Court of Justice of the European Union came out with a very important decision in May, upholding that compensation right, the publisher right, based on copyright. And that was quite a very important finding in the EU, where a lot of the work has been based on copyright and a mix of competition law. So Irene, I don't want to go on for too long, but I do think that it does talk to the need for getting that consultation from the different sectors and for people, to say what they think being left out. I think, one of the things that came out of the breakaway, certainly from the APAC region, and I'll just mention this and end it here, is that the Indonesians are piloting and pushing for a solution at the level of copyright at the global WIPO level. Obviously, there are legacy structures and collective management organizations that collect or supposedly collect royalties for musicians and for writers, etc., which are more sort of historically linked to copyright collection. Journalism has never been in that scheme, has never been part of it, and the Indonesians are now pushing for that, not just for journalism, but for also how do you deal with content, cross-border usage of content by these global platforms. So the very complex issue, and I think that's something that we will certainly be looking at when we look at how to update the final guidance. Thanks.
Thanks, Michael. A lot of really interesting points that have been raised. Another reminder for those who are in the webinar, please do add your thoughts and any questions that you have into the chat to keep this a flowing conversation. I did want to quickly ask Anna Cristina, there is this discussion about, the views from the different sectors. I think that certainly in this group, we have representatives from those who are, kind of studying the issue of information integrity, who look at the issue of media viability and media sustainability. What has been the engagement with the tech platforms in terms of not only this particular kind of this framework and these guidelines, but in all of the work that UNESCO has done on looking at kind of platform regulation and all the other engagements related to this? Because you can't really talk about the future of platforms and information without engaging those who are actually hosting and disseminating the information.
Yes, thank you very much, Sharon. So let me know if because I see that my camera is moving. I think it's a little bit confusing. So if you want, I can turn off the camera.
It's all good, and you sound
okay.
perfect. So please
Okay,
proceed.
So I have to say that it's very important to acknowledge that UNESCO's approach to governance of digital platforms or AI actors has been always a multi-stakeholder approach, where they have a seat on the table and that can engage and participate in the consultations process, but also in the different moments where we set the principles into action. So from the beginning, the platforms have been consulted and they have engaged, all of them, in the guidelines for the governance of digital platforms. They have engaged together with the Global Forum of Networks of Regulatory Authorities, and they have engaged with the I14 Knowledge Network, which is a group of think tanks around the world that are creating a trusted interface to try to evaluate how the guidelines are being implemented in different parts of the world. It's also important to say that this engagement has not been neither constant in the same way, neither, let's say, very successful in a way that goes beyond the consultation process or the particular engagement in certain topics that require, for instance, to develop human rights due diligence in certain moments, in certain contexts, for instance, in case of elections, or in certain crisis contexts, for instance, in an outbreak or of an emergency or a natural disaster. These are important topics where they have engaged. They have engaged as well in different moments for the protection of critical voices when it comes to types of aggressions against journalists that have been being subject of certain types of risk to the deployment of their services and certain types of technology. So they create mechanisms to either understand the type of risk that they're facing and to try to mitigate those risks. This has been a successful engagement in some cases, but I think that there's still a long way to go. And this is why UNESCO has been working together with this global forum of networks of regulatory authorities that brings together regulators from all over the world to try to create convergence in a common ground set of principles, where engagement with the platforms is in the same terms of transparency, accountability, due diligence, user empowerment, and alignment to international human rights standards. We believe that the possibility for platforms to engage comes with the strength of unity. So this means that we really believe that if we think that only one territory will make the change, will not happen, or only one actor, just media pushing for this guidance is not going to work. We need to see this as an integrated approach that will allow not only as well audiovisual regulators, competition regulators, data protection regulators to come together, where they need to have an integrated approach, because we're dealing with platforms that have an integrated system. So it's very, very important for us to create this conversation and to acknowledge that and then this comes to the silver bullet title of the session, that we will not get results, not even if we have the greatest will of the platforms, if we don't have the engagement of the other parts of the ecosystem. We need to make sure that all of the elements of the puzzle come together in order to have an actual and meaningful achievement. And I think the value of this first draft is to try to bring to acknowledge that there's already work that is being happening, that there's already actors that are coming together, that there's already media houses that are trying to find solutions, that there's already evaluations that have allowed us to see that smaller media houses have been impacted for this in a different way than the others. So we are not working from, like from zero. And I think that also the opportunity of for UNESCO to launch this consultation is also to acknowledge that this cannot be seen only as one element that relates to public interest media or the defense of freedom of expression and media development, but it also comes with the whole ecosystem on how we're going to relate, for instance, in the case of compensation, on how the journalists relate to how they govern cloud services and their engagement with cloud services that goes beyond these guidelines, but that relates also to their work. So I think this is the idea. And definitely, yes, the platforms should be part of this discussion. But first, we need to come together. First, we need to unite each other in order to create a common ground and agree with the principles where we want to stand in front of them.
Thank you, Ana Cristina. I think this, this, what your interventions, and also the comment that Janine made, and also in the group chat about the question of who benefits, who gets excluded, who's included. I think that one thing that we'd like to acknowledge is that there are power asymmetries all throughout this discussion. When you're talking about quite frankly, these are global platforms, so there's an asymmetry when you're dealing with very, very large, richly funded private organizations that operate in countries all around the world. There are priority markets, naturally, as we see, for any and all corporations, especially tech companies. So the amount of attention that is being kind of served in terms of which market you're serving also lends itself to kind of power inequalities and asymmetries when you're talking about certain markets perhaps having more influence over regulatory processes than others. But the need being perhaps very, very different if you're talking about low and middle income countries versus Europe and United States or other markets that perhaps are richer and have more influence. You also then have the power asymmetry when you're discussing about which media will benefit. And this goes to what Janine mentioned, which is that, quite frankly, as was indicated in the document, that, there have been some reflections about certain interventions that have taken place, which have disproportionately benefited large media companies. And I think that is, that honestly, that's been feedback that has been reflected not only by media, but also the platform companies themselves when they have responded. And so, the question is, and I think this is a question for everyone in this room, is how do we overcome those, kind of imbalances and inequities across the board, to create to speak with, sort of one voice, while also acknowledging the very, very, very real differences in how this will play out, whether you're talking about by market or by, sector, as a segment of the sector, in terms of who benefits and who wins and who loses. I'd love anyone to kind of offer some thoughts on this.
Can I just jump in and say something, Irene? Because I think
Sure.
it's very important to say that because this is a process of consultation, I would also invite those that are in the chat to tell us what are those solutions that we should think about. Because, you know, like sometimes the people that are drafting, sometimes we run our we get the solutions in many cases from the people that is helping us to build this. So also, you know, like for the people in the panel, but please also feel free to put your thoughts on this question into the chat.
Anyone else want to? Yes, Janine, please go ahead. Oh, Janine, I think, are you muted?
Exactly. That's what I was asking,
Okay,
if I could be unmuted. While I cannot propose any solutions here that are the silver bullet as we're discussing today, I wanted to come back to that point where, Michael, you were mentioning that, of course, there is not one solution that can be proposed here or that you want to present as the key to solving this issue of news compensation. But I mean, at CINIA, perhaps we were just hoping for a bit more of an orientation, in the sense that we understand that it's not reasonable to prescribe one thing, especially with me sitting here in Namibia and comparing the Namibian and the South African media market. Such different issues at hand. In Namibia, it looks so different from South Africa, where the platform value extraction is actually such a big issue. Namibia is such a small market. There have been very different issues here. Specifically government advertising being focused on certain government positive-leaning media. But besides that, I think what we were hoping to see is a bit of an orientation on certain types of media and specific groups of people that might not be benefiting if we don't look at specific aspects of the frameworks that must be covered. And I have to be honest, I was so surprised at seeing that gender was not included as an analytical category at all in the draft. Since, I mean, it is included in the Johannesburg Declaration, but then when I thought a bit deeper, I noticed that gender is often not included when we look at media viability or any economic aspects of the media landscape. Often we have, well, these documents, for example, also by the UNESCO, where they put impetus on, yes, gender equality is one of our priorities, but we often look at it surrounding the topics of harm, TFGBV, and so on. So yeah, I was a bit surprised by that. And I think we should perhaps even go a bit further. I have this background in feminist research, and so I was thinking actually a feminist perspective on the document reveals a few blind spots, perhaps. It's not just about adding gender as a box to tick that we have covered this, but I think if we look at the document from that perspective, we see that yes, smaller community alternative media are being mentioned, but we are not looking at the structural issues that we might be reinforcing if we don't mention specific groups, such as women. Sarah McCarrier recently mentioned that after COVID, a lot of women-led media have been founded in Africa, specifically because they couldn't find a way back into the workforce in the larger media companies. And so if we talk about wanting to support and strengthen smaller and independent media, for example, on the African continent, I think we should not be blind to the gendered aspect of this. And if we look at bargaining power and the power to negotiate with these big tech platforms, I think a gendered analysis or even a feminist perspective as a larger could be very beneficial to see where we might have to readjust those minimum how can I call them? What can I call them? These minimum orientations that we would need when we think about coming up with mechanisms for fair compensation that is really fair.
Thanks, Janine. Any other thoughts before I turn to a new topic? Oh, Wendy, please.
Just wanted to go back to this point about defining public interest media and defining who gets to benefit from compensation schemes. and say that this is something that we really are grappling with. And so I really want to encourage submissions and feedback specifically on this question, because it has to be addressed in the guidance. And it currently is not, because it's one of those kind of questions that we were holding out on until we got more feedback from the kind of ecosystem. And just to say that the challenges that we're grappling with are on so many different levels. So I think the first is to say that I think there's agreement that it's a balance. At some point, we have to find the appropriate balance of who gets included and who gets excluded. If you are too inclusive, you get accused of supporting non-public interest media. If you're too exclusive, it's typically the small local community media, women-led media, those kinds of organizations that are excluded. And so in order to find that right balance, there are several things that we're kind of reflecting on as the drafting team. The first is that we've heard from some people, I think kind of the dominant perspective it seems at the moment is that it's really important that these safeguards are put in place to ensure that only public interest media, as defined, benefits from compensation mechanisms. Now, what that actually is one of those tricky questions. Is it membership in some sort of independent self-regulatory mechanism? Not all countries have that. Is it membership in some sort of international body that may not be accessible for media in some organizations? So we would really welcome tangible feedback on what those criteria are that people or publishers should meet. And then secondly, we've heard a very contrary perspective, which says that because this problem fundamentally comes down to an unfair usage of content based on rights, either sort of a copyright right that someone holds, or other kind of rights that publishers hold over their content. Anyone whose rights are violated in the use of that content should be entitled to compensation, regardless of whether they meet some definition of public interest media. And that's kind of the contrary perspective that has come out. And so we're really grappling with where the majority of the perspectives fall on that question. And it's one of several questions which we specifically highlighted in the survey because we would really welcome feedback on it. So I just wanted to emphasize that.
Thanks, Wendy. I mean, I think this is a perfect segue because I've been monitoring the chat, and there has been some discussion about this very specific issue, which is a focus on news. On the one hand, you also have big tech companies, you have big media companies. And what does this look like when you're talking about public interest information, right? And I think that, to me, the reason why these are very important questions of defining and also drawing circles is because, everyone who is discussing this issue comes at it from a point of self-interest, right? I think that there's this question of, and of course, this is very natural. It's like if you work for a media company, your concern is about, whether there's a long-term sustainability of that media company. I think taking a step back and looking at how, how people around the world are accessing information, how they're leveraging these technologies to get the information they need to live their daily lives, and where they go and what they define as news or valuable information is actually a very important frame to discuss this, because it's one thing to, the danger is that if the focus becomes on preserving certain categories, it may miss actually the trend of how people are actually using information. And, I'm surprised that we've gotten 49 minutes into this conversation and no one's mentioned creators or influencers, citizen journalists, others who produce information for the in the information landscape. I think that the reason why there's such a focus, of course, on media is because there is a monetization crisis for journalism that we've been seeing, kind of a slow crisis, that is now, with the advent of generative AI, kind of really just exploded, right? And so that's why we are at this inflection point. But the question of who's in, who's out, these are questions, and who are we comfortable deciding who is in and who is out is a really, really relevant question, because this is where you see the diversity based on government context. Are you comfortable with the government deciding who gets compensated or not? Are you comfortable with deciding having industry bodies decide who's in and who's out? What power imbalances and asymmetries become part of those sorts of frameworks if you lean one way or the other? And then, at the highest level, the question of, what are we trying to protect, right? What are we trying to preserve, and to what end? These are very, very tricky questions that I think need to be asked from all parties. And so I'd love to hear sort of everyone's thoughts on the panel about, how do you build a global framework when there's so much nuance on all these questions? And then, when you talk about things such as regulation, it's like, what are the safeguards that need to be in place to ensure that the regulation doesn't itself become a tool for further either censorship or control or kind of a cutting off of human rights.
Irene, can I
Yes,
jump
of course,
in?
Michael.
I mean, just one thing that's kind of maybe obvious, but maybe needs to be stated, is that all of the examples that all of the sort of case studies that we refer to, or regulation in action studies, actually are based on the fact that they're pretty strong institutions in those countries. And I think that it would be wrong to draw too many lessons that are not applicable to countries where you need to build those institutions. That's why UNESCO's role is so important. And Anna Christina mentioned the role of the regulators, because unless you actually look at it multi-sided and you look at how to strengthen institutions in a lot of parts of the world which don't have these gold-plated regulatory institutions with all these resources, etc., how do you make it work in the smaller countries? How do you make it work for smaller media, etc.? I mean, one way, and the sort of the South African model that we put out there, and it is in the report about eligibility, is the model, and it might not work everywhere because people have different structures, is instead of getting into the thorny issue of what constituted public interest media, basically eligibility to any financial compensation was determined by your membership of independent self-regulatory bodies that had codes of conduct that was acceptable. And if you were prepared to be like, accountability was the price of entry, as I put it. So basically that was one model where you could say we avoided that debate because it was quite a difficult debate to build. And we thought, well, at least if you're accountable, maybe it doesn't mean you're public interest, but it shows that you are prepared to live and die by your words and be accountable for them. So that's the one thing. But I really think it's important that we do take into account that a lot of these mechanisms, the success of them being implemented elsewhere, will depend on the institutional framework of those countries and the ability of those institutions to implement any of these mechanisms. That might sound obvious, but I think it might be missed because we're only focusing on what is being implemented. And if you look at those countries, I think the point is pretty obvious.
Thanks, Michael. Anna Christina?
Yes, I want to say two things that I think that might be helpful to get a little bit of what are UNESCO's thoughts on how these governance systems work, and not only in terms of foreign compensation, but we actually decided after the consultation process of the first guidelines for the governance of digital platforms not to call it regulation, because we truly believe that this is an issue that has to converge different forms of regulation, including self-regulatory processes, and that it depends on the context of a specific jurisdictions and the type of actors that converge in that jurisdiction, the type of governance approach that they have to put in place. The guidelines are set in three primary pillars. One is acknowledging that we need to enable the environment for freedom of expression. That is not only making sure that media is sustainable and viable, but that there's enough safeguards for the safety and protection of journalists to do their work in a safe manner. Then we have another element that is exactly what Michael mentioned, that is the independence of the governance system. Whatever is the type of governance that we're talking about, we need that the possibility to have independent governance that create mechanisms to oversee how the systems and the processes on the deployment of these digital services are happening, and we need to make sure that this relies on the transparency, accountability, due diligence that I already mentioned. And the third element is to make sure that these platforms, like explain clearly, not only to the governance, but to the users, what is happening and what are the type of control they are putting in place in order to make sure that whatever the users are consuming is a trustworthy information. This is, let's say, the guidelines framework. Now, this guidance, and I have to say it as well, the guidance that a multilateral organization gives to UNESCO are tools for member states that will enable them, to implement or to align their different action to other governments. In this case, considering the transborder nature of digital platforms and AI services, what we would like is to have a sharing of knowledge, a sharing of common principles, a sharing of good practices. So we believe this guidance will never cover all of the different nuances of a given context, because that's up to each of the member states to adapt. And when I talk about member states, I also talk about the civil society, the media, and all of the integration of these member states. So I think that this is also very important, because like a guidance, it's a document that guide the steps, but it's not a silver bullet. It's not the document that will set the regulation tone. It depends a lot on what is happening in each of the jurisdictions. But it definitely, I think this element is key that you mentioned, Irene, is to allow us through the consultation process to know what are the parameters that need to be considered by each of the member states when they define what are the elements they need to look at in their own context. What are the key issues that they need to observe, either from the platforms that need to comply with, either from the communities they want to benefit, either from the, but always I'd say everything is settled in one key aim, that is safeguarding freedom of expression and access to information.
Thank you, Ana Cristina. I feel like that was the perfect way to end the webinar, because I think it leads us to our call to action, which is to ask everyone to contribute to the consultation process, to bring forth the issues and the questions and the considerations that are so prominent in your own local context, to make sure that those are reflected in this synthesis, and to bring forth ideas as well. I think that to me is, the opportunity. And we really want to thank M20 for convening this webinar, for UNESCO to bring this issue into the multilateral context, and really offering the opportunity to have this consultation. And finally, to my amazing panelists for this webinar, who have contributed to such a robust discussion and really raised, I think, some of the key and critical issues. If I may, in the last 60 seconds, just quickly summarize the themes. One is, it feels like, based on the conversation, that the answer to the name of this webinar is that this is not going to be a silver bullet, but it is an opportunity to bring forth the different opportunities and the different ideas that can, in aggregate, around the world, provide solutions and paths forward to help to address this issue that we all agree is so important, which is preserving the access for everyone to have in having high quality public interest information and journalism, that it is critical for societies, and that there are remedies and solutions that can be taken, actions that can be taken. We don't need to just sit here and wait for things to get better or worse. That the industry and the multi-stakeholders who are involved in tackling these issues can come together, can have a conversation, and that conversation is cross-border, it is global. It's about information sharing, and it's about bringing all that creativity and all the kind of energy into this global space. With that, I'd like to thank you all for your time. And again, thank you to the panelists for joining the conversation. I believe that this will be made available to others in the future. So, for those who are not online yet, but we'll see this later, don't forget to contribute to the survey and to read the full document.